What's up, my wizards? It's Dev, aka Toxoplasmosis Jones from Mtg. We like it a magic. I don't have my hands free for that, but still, there was some magic in the air. I'm here with Ziggy and Waverly and Julie, and there's definitely some kind of theme going on today.
Yo, I'm sorting through some heinous haters like a pooper scooper. I'm just trying to take my life like a Koopa Trooper. I'm Double Mario, that mean I'm super. And I'm freaking dangerous like a Chupa Cabre. Got them all day like a Kanye, but I'm way better getting cheddar in Monterey. But Jack, you don't know, man. You got the show, man. You want roast beef? Well, I'm Arby's.
And we're back. Now, don't act like you didn't know what the first deck of the season had to be. We kind of like cats around here. Who doesn't like cats, right?
It looks like a demon.
It used to look like a demon.
It's acting like a demon.
Okay, so that's one guy. Doesn't like cats, but the rest of us all like cats. That's why we clicked on the video. And if you can't tell, I'm kind of a cat person, man thing. So as soon as I saw Kaheera over here sounding like a character from The Lion King, that's a Lion King name, I knew that this was going to be the first deck of the season. I put it on the Patreon poll just, just to see if something else might win, but no, we knew. I have amassed an army of fellow cat people on Patreon, so I knew that deck was going to win. And so here we are, first deck of the season. Let's talk Abzan Cats with Kaheera as our companion. Now, Kaheera's a fierce companion, and it turns out a lot of companions are fierce. More on that in just a second, but just real quick, if you blow up Kaheera's art, it turns out she's not as fierce as you might have thought at first glance. She's actually making kind of a silly face. It's hard to take seriously. But back to companions for just a second. We've only had a couple of days to brew with Ikoria on MTG Arena, at time of recording at least. But companions have already kind of started to take over the conversation. And I was here on the couch during the preseason trying to tell you that a free card that you just start the game with in your hand, but is nonetheless protected from agonizing remorse and thought erasure and other discard effects, is that's good. That's a pretty good proposition to just draw an extra card at the beginning of the game. That's good, right? But now, all during the previews, there are people like, companions, they look a little dumb to me. Too many hoops to jump through. It's not worth it. Look what happened already. You got stuff like Garuda and Yorion and other companions that are just completely breaking standard at the moment, and the people are crying that the sky is falling and all that. But all that said, Kaheera's still kind of standing on the sidelines like, I'm good too, and she is pretty freaking good, it turns out. There are sequences we can play out on turns 1 and 2 that give this immediate impact when it hits the board on turn 3, and don't discount the fact that it makes all your kitties vigilant. It can be really important for a number of reasons. Small ball aggro decks that we're up against, we can get in hits against without really fear of a crackback. Vigilance is a better ability than it gets credit for, just on a base level, and this card helps prove that. But combined with a cat that we'll talk about a little bit earlier, you can just win the game all at one time. It's one of the most important in-game combos in the deck, and it just completely litter boxes opponents. But we're not done with legendary cats, actually, because we're going to talk about Lurrus of the Dream Den, definitely the more impressive of the 3-drop legendary cats in this deck, but I didn't want to make this our companion because then we couldn't play Kaheera, right? So sometimes you'll opt to play this on turn 3 instead of Kaheera, but that's a pretty good situation to be in. If you lost a creature on turn 1 and 2, this can be well worth playing on turn 3, but sometimes you'll play Kaheera on turn 3 and then Lurrus on turn 4, followed by a 1-drop that you've lost at that point in the game. So that can be important to remember. Sometimes you'll wait until turn 5 to cast Lurrus. That way you can cast Lurrus and then cast a 2-drop out of your graveyard. It can be a very important line. It's also great for recovering from sweepers, which is something we need a little bit of help with. Opponents are still playing Deafening Clarions, Shadow the Skies. Those haven't gone anywhere in Ikoria Standard, and they're probably more important than ever, so we need to be prepared for them. Lurrus on turn 5 can immediately cast a 2-drop out of your graveyard, which is a great way to recover from a Shatter. Or just if you top deck Lurrus in the late game, he's more or less guaranteed to create card advantage, even if your opponent can deal with him. All of that's important to remember. But let's get to the rest of the cats in the deck, starting with the 4 copies of Cauldron Familiar that you knew I was playing, and the 3 copies of Witch's Oven that you probably assumed I was playing. But you might have thought I was playing 4 copies of Witch's Oven. It's not as central to our game plan as it is to the mono black decks that have the Nightmare Shepherd tricks. It's not as central to our game plan as it is to the Jund or Golgari Sacrifice decks that have Trail of Crumbs. We don't really have any of that stuff, so I don't feel like we need all 4 copies of Witch's Oven, but you'll still be happy to get it as long as you have a Cauldron Familiar, and sometimes Even when you don't have a Cauldron Familiar, you'd be happy to see a Witch's Oven. If you've got a Lurrus out, you can just sacrifice creatures to make food, gain a little bit of life, and then just replay them out of your graveyard with your Lurrus. Can be an important line, but remember too that since you've got Lurrus, that allows you to play Cauldron Familiar out of your graveyard even if you don't have a food token. Sometimes that equates to just casting Cauldron Familiar out of your graveyard one extra time per turn, and that can be really important. Now, I'm also playing 3 copies of Ajani's Pridemate in the deck. It's that kind of party, that's right. Now, honestly, I didn't have the gumption, the courage to play all 4 copies of this, because sometimes it's not going to do a whole heck of a lot. Other times, it does everything. This goes really well with our Witch's Oven Cauldron Familiar combo, growing our Ajani's Pridemate at least once a turn. If we get more ovens, it grows it even more. Goes well with Lurrus's lifelink, obviously, but also goes well with Lurrus's ability to play Cauldron Familiar out of our graveyard, another way to grow our Ajani's Pridemate. But that's not it. We've got other ancillary ways of gaining life in this deck, so Ajani's Pridemate is a little bit easier to grow than you might think at first glance. And we need a creature like this, because we have the ability to play 2-drops over and over out of our yard at least once a turn with Lurrus. That can be really important, but if we're facing down a bunch of big creatures on the other side of the table, it really doesn't help much. So it's nice to have a creature that can grow big enough to get through the line almost no matter how big our opponent's side of the table is. It can be really important. We don't have a whole lot of ways of doing that outside of maybe 1 or 2 other creatures in our deck. Getting through the line is incredibly important in those stalemates, and Ajani's Pridemate getting big is one of the best ways of doing that. But of course, if our opponent ever kills our Pridemate, no harm, no foul, we just play it out of our graveyard and start growing it again. But a 2-drop cat that I liked a little bit more was Bronze-Eyed Lion. This thing has really impressed me, so long as we get it on turn 2. We can play it into a near guaranteed turn 3 Kaheera, and now we've only paid 2 mana for our 4/4 Vigilance that can swing through, hit for damage, but still stay up to block almost any creature in the early game profitably. So that's just a really important line right there. In the early game, Bronze-Eyed Lion is amazing. If it does die, it'll come back to help protect our Lurrus or our Kaheera or any other creature that we might want to keep out, or that we don't have the ability to get back out of our graveyard with a Lurrus. That can be important too. So the ability to either go indestructible itself, protect itself from sweepers, that can be important, or put indestructibility in a way on one of our key legendary creatures. All of that important too. Now, if it dies with no creatures on the battlefield, it goes to our graveyard, at which point Lurrus can just play it out of our graveyard a little bit later in the game. If it does come back, and then the creature it's attached to dies, they both go to the graveyard and can be played with Lurrus out of our graveyard. So it's just a really cool card from a bunch of different angles in this deck, and if nothing else, it becomes a really overstated creature. But the time has come to tell you that I may have cheated just a little bit when building this deck, because one of our creatures isn't a cat, but it still meets the requirements for Kaheera, so I had to play 3 copies of Fiend Artisan. I just could not help myself. I know this is $30 a pop, or a Mythic Wildcard per, and that can hurt, but you could always play copies of Dread Malkin. I was originally playing that in the deck as another 1-drop. Pretty cool to be able to sack stuff to Dread Malkin and then just play it back with Lurrus. That's a nice ability to have. That's good. But there's also a 4-drop cat that I'll talk about in just a second that you could up the copies of. We're only playing 2 copies, but it's such an important cat that you could play more copies rather than play Fiend Artisan. So there. I've given you some stuff you can do rather than play it, but at the same time, being able to play this out of our graveyard with the Lurrus just simply is the best play in the deck. It goes so well with Lurrus because you can sacrifice things to, go get whatever creature you want and then just play the thing you sacrificed out of your graveyard with Lurrus. You can even sacrifice a Cauldron Familiar, pay 4 mana, sacrifice a Cauldron Familiar, go search up a Lurrus, put it onto the battlefield, and then replay the Cauldron Familiar out of your graveyard, because now you have a Lurrus. It's just such a silly card with Lurrus that I had to play it. And in the late game, it scales to a 4/4, a 5/5, a 6/6 really easily. And just like I was saying with the Ajani's Pridemate, it's important to have a creature that scales with the game state so it can break through that line. Honestly, I think the actual deck that you probably want to play if you don't care about cats is just some sort of Abzan Lurrus Fiend Artisan concoction. But even with the cat conceit, this deck did so much better than I thought it was going to, in large part because of this combo. But we've hit the last cat in the deck, and that's Franlan Felidar. Just 2 copies of this, but again, if you don't have the swag to play, Fiend Artisan, you could always play 3 or even 4 copies of Felidar, because it turns out this is actually one of the most important cards in the deck. I've alluded to it already, but in the late game, this can just be a blowout. All your creatures have vigilance because of Kaheera. Right, so if you have a big enough board, you can swing in, and then before the blockers are declared, pay mana to tap all your creatures and tap down your opponent's creatures. Your creatures are still swinging, and your opponent's creatures can't block. So this is a way to force through a ton of damage in the late game and just clean the game up right there. And thanks to Fiend Artisan, we have the ability to just go get a Franlan Felidar anytime we want to. In the late game, it costs 5 mana to do that, but you'll sometimes have mana left over to tap down creatures. You don't have to swing with Franlan Felidar that turn. Just all of your other creatures will have vigilance if you have a Kaheera out. So you can go search up Franlan Felidar, use any extra mana you might have laying around to tap down your opponent's creatures on attacks, and just get in and win that turn. This has happened many, many times during testing, and just like Lurrus plus Fiend Artisan, this is another one of the absolute best plays in the deck, and another good reason to play Fiend Artisan for that matter. But that's all of the creatures in the deck. You might have thought that this would be just a 30-cat deck with like Icon of Ancestry naming cats or something. No, we're not doing that. I actually want to win as many games as possible. So this is effectively a kind of Abzan mid-range deck because our cats can't do it all for us. We have to set up these combos and we have to remove things along the way in order to make sure we can do the things we want to do. But luckily, Abzan has access to tons of amazing removal. So we're going to play a couple of copies of Heartless Act, try out that new card, along with 2 copies of Mythos of Nethroi, another sweet new card to try out, and 3 copies of Elspeth Conquers Death, which is actually one of the more important cards in our entire deck. Now, Heartless Act, just a stellar, amazing Magic card. So far in testing, this has been great, and I'm actually thinking about somehow upping it to 3 copies because it's just that good to have this kind of Doomblade effect in Standard right now. Often kills, Nissalands, Hydroid Krasis, and whatnot, as long as it's a relatively small Krasis. Or you can block the Krasis. Krasis blocks one of your things. Kill it with Heartless Act, take the rest of the counters off, sometimes save your own creature that way. There are just so many tricks with Heartless Act, even against creatures that have counters. It's just such a good card. Play Heartless Act. Mythos of Nethroi, I kind of feel the same way about. Hate that this is a 3-drop. Kind of feels a little overcosted in some instances, but this is still an out against Teferi. You absolutely need that in this deck. It's an out against all kinds of planeswalkers and enchantments for that matter, things like Fires, Wilderness Reclamation, which are seeing even more play, especially Fires. It feels like it's seeing even more play in the last couple of days, but, Mythos is just able to basically clean up anything on the other side of the table, and that's important to have access to. Now, Elspeth Conquers Death. Again, one of the most important cards in the deck, a really important piece of removal to have access to. Sometimes screws your opponent up, keeps them off of countering our stuff on Chapter 2. That's important as well. But most important thing is Chapter 3 because this can bring back Franlan Felidars, Kaheeras, and Lurruses, things that can't be brought back by Lurrus's ability. And obviously all of these creatures have huge bullseyes on their back, so it's important to have a way to reanimate them, give them those 9 lives that they're advertised as having, right? Lurrus is such an important card to the deck especially that we need to have a way to get it back. I was considering playing Sorin in this spot, but it turns out Elspeth is just the much better card, even if we have to wait a couple of turns to reanimate these important creatures. Now, I'm also working in 2 copies of the Birth of Melodis. I felt like we needed another couple of 2-drops to really hold down the early game. Plus, this is great against the aggro decks in the format, but it does so much more than that. Coolest trick that you can do with it is that you can play it out of your graveyard with a Lurrus. Lurrus just says permanents. It doesn't say creatures. As long as you got permanents in your yard that cost 2 or less, you can play them. It does some kind of tertiary things the deck likes. It goes and gets that 3rd white source for turn 3 to make sure you can play Kaheera or Lurrus. That's very important. More important than you might think. But it also gains a little bit of life. That's important for a Johnny's Pride mate. You can grow it a little bit like that. And maybe most importantly, this creates that 0/4. That's good in the early game to block aggro decks, set our plan up, but it also creates a creature that we really don't mind sacrificing to Fiend Artisan. It's really good fodder for Fiend Artisan too. So just a hot little card right here, and I'm only playing a couple of copies of it, but it's worth it. But to finish the main deck off here, we're going to play 2 copies of Vraska Golgari Queen, too. Now, I was also kind of hurting for proper 4-drops to play, and I think Vraska is absolutely the best one for all kinds of reasons. First of all, we can sacrifice things to her and then just replay them out of our graveyard with Lurrus while drawing cards, something the deck needs. A little bit of card advantage goes a long way in a deck like this. But also gains a life, which can be important if we have an Ajani's Pride mate. So just the first ability, there's a lot of value we can jam into that. But obviously it's important to have a piece of removal like this that again can take out Teferis and other important like 3-mana planeswalkers and other like really important 3-mana threats because there's a ton of them. Again, we have to spend some time getting set up in this deck. So we need things like Vraska to knock our opponent off of their perch and allow us the time we need to do the things. But sometimes, if you can ultimate Vraska, you just win the game because, again, it's pretty easy to replay stuff out of your graveyard with Lurrus and always have important threats that can get through for at least some damage. So sometimes Vraska's ultimate is just I win the game right then and there. But mostly it's these first 2 abilities I'm worried about, and just alternating between them can sometimes win the game outright in and of itself. Now, there's 25 lands in the deck, and that might seem like a lot to some ears, but we're a 3-color deck that needs all 3 colors. That's one reason to play a healthy number of lands, but Fiend Artisan is a hungry card. Fronland Felidar is a hungry card, especially if you want to play it and then use that ability on your creatures that same turn. Requires a lot of mana, plus there's important 4 and 5 drops in the deck, so we need to play a decent number of lands. I think 25 is right, especially with Birth of Melodis sort of helping us out in the mana production department. That's important. But all in all, we've got 16 white sources, 14 black sources, and 13 green sources, and this has not given me a problem, even one time. Now here's our sideboard right here. Remember that 1 copy of Kaheera is sort of in our main deck because companions take up a sideboard slot. Now, the 2 copies of Myers Grasp, probably my favorite card in the sideboard. I gotta say, it's so cheeky. You can replay it out of your graveyard with a Lurrus, so you can just string together kills on your opponent's creatures turn by turn, and that can be really important against aggro. Agonizing Remorse is in there just to deal with any combo plans or just anything that blows up our plan. Agonizing Remorse can be a very important card. Noxious Grasp is in there to deal with things Noxious Grasp deals with. Same thing with Devout Decree. Taking out white and green, and then red and black, respectively. Permanents can be really very, very important on both of these. They're great sideboard cards. And then finally, Wilt. Playing Wilt Chamberlain in the sideboard here. You could play things like Gem Razor or Thrashing Brontodon or whatever, but I really, really like Wilt. It's only a couple of mana to use, and you can cycle it away if you do happen to draw it when you don't need it. And here are them power rankings for you right here. Final score of 67, which is actually like much, much better than I anticipated this deck was going to be. In the early season, I was still playing this with proxies, and I built it as kind of a meme, but when I started putting it through the gauntlet of currently existing standard decks at the time, it did much better than I thought it was going to do, especially against decks like Mono Red, where if you get the right start, that deck has no hope against you. It also tested great against all the various control decks in the format. Just any blue-white variant, this is pretty decent against. We've got multiple answers to Teferi. We don't care too much about Teferi in the first place in this deck. Lurrus is great. If they sweep the board, we can get stuff back. Same thing with Elspeth Conquers Death, which is also an answer to Teferi. If we get Fronland Felidar, we really don't care if they have Dream Trawler, because we can tap it down. Even if they give it Hexproof, it's tapped down, so it's really not that big of a deal to deal with the Dream Trawler thanks to Fronland Felidar. This deck has multiple answers to really important stuff in the blue-white deck. The issue is that we live in the mid-game. We are a mid-range deck that does have some ways of gaining value over time, but a lot of decks that gain value on key turns in this format are just good against us. Things like Fires of Invention, even if we have a decent start, if they have the turn where they just like, oh, turn 4 fires, we can't deal with that, turn 5, Kenrith into Cavalier of some kind, like, we're in trouble. We're in trouble there. So there are some decks like, for instance, Garuda, the new Garuda deck. If they actually get to, turn 4, turn 5, cast Garuda, hit Spark Double or Thassa or whatever, then yeah, we're in a fair amount of trouble. So some of these combo decks that can just, have these key turns on turn 4 and turn 5 will usually overcome us. But that's why we have cards like Agonizing Remorse on the board to deal with plans like that. This does have real game against a fair number of decks in the format, but there are also a number of decks that crush its hopes completely. So that's actually the mark of a pretty balanced deck right there. But once this one gets rocking and rolling, and you're actually doing some of those synergies I was talking about earlier, you feel real good. Matter of fact, you don't just feel good. You feel like a Tiger King. I did it. Damn it. I didn't. My intention was to go through the video without a Tiger King joke, because 3 months later you're going to watch this video and be like, what was Tiger King? I'm sure it's going to date the video very, very hardcore later on, but I didn't say anything about Carol Baskin. I didn't say anything about, hey, welcome my cool cats and kitties. I didn't do any of that. I was able to help myself, but at the end of the day, I just had to make a Tiger King joke. But damn it, Dev. But anyway, I guess I'm done for this one. So like the video if you enjoyed it. Do all that YouTube stuff. It would really help me out if you subscribed and hit the bell for notifications so YouTube actually tells you when I put videos out. Should be the point of subscribing, but now you have to go through a 2-step process. I don't make the rules. Just help you do it out. You can also hit the deck list in the description to go over to TCG Player. If you pre-order any of this stuff for this deck through that link, you'll be helping me out tremendously. So give that a shot if you want to. It's a really good deck, it turns out. A lot better than I thought it was going to be. Built the deck as a meme, didn't think it was going to win games, but here we are. I've actually moved up the ladder a good bit with it in the last couple of days. So, I don't know, it's not bad, right? So give the deck a shot if you possibly can. I had fun with it. I think you will too. And aside from that, I guess the last way you can help me out, but definitely the most effective way to help me out, is to go to patreon.com/sbmtg or hit that link in the description to do so. And all I ask is $1 a month. 1 order of French fries per month. That's it. And you can vote on what decks we even do around here in the first place. I'm also thinking about adding something to the $5 tier, by the way, that you're not currently getting. And that is deck lists a day in advance. Patrons that exist already and are patrons to me. Let me know if you're interested in that. Down there in the comments section. I'll do a Patreon post about it later. And then you can let me know in further detail. But I'm thinking about adding that to the $5 tier, so keep that in mind. But all I really ask is $1 a month. That'll help you vote on what we do around here. But in any case, I'm pretty much done for this one, so I guess I'll catch you cats later. I gotta let Waverly out. Yeah, you want to get out so bad, don't you? I don't blame you. It's hot in here. It's hot in here with the stage lights. I'll be right there, baby. But anyway, love you guys. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.